The first-class cabin was quiet, humming with the low rumble of the engines. Passengers adjusted their seats, sipped coffee, scrolled through phones, or stared out of tiny oval windows at the endless blue sky. For most, it was just another routine flight. But for Manny Pacquiao, it was no ordinary morning. Calm, composed, he walked down the aisle, wearing a simple polo shirt and jeans, carrying nothing more than a small bag. There was no entourage, no flashy entrance, just him, quietly confident. The moment he approached the first-class section, the atmosphere shifted. The flight attendants, who had been chatting softly with passengers, suddenly stiffened. Their smiles vanished, replaced by looks of suspicion, even irritation. One of them stepped forward abruptly, her voice sharp and clipped. "Sir, you can't sit here. This section is reserved," she said, her words carrying an edge that went beyond policy. It wasn't just protocol, it was disdain. Another attendant glanced at Manny, then back at her colleague, whispering loud enough for others to hear. "Do you think he belongs here? He looks ordinary." Manny paused, his expression neutral, calm as ever. He didn't flinch. He didn't respond with anger. Instead, he pulled out his boarding pass and smiled politely. "I have a ticket for this seat," he said evenly. The cabin fell into a tense silence. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, sensing the sudden tension. Some glanced at Manny with recognition, but others, unaware, just noticed the unusual energy, the cold judgment that now hung thick in the air. Phones began to peek out of pockets, some passengers quietly filming, others whispering to neighbors. The flight attendants exchanged uneasy glances, clearly caught off guard by the calm, unshakable demeanor of the man they were trying to intimidate. What was meant to be a routine check had transformed into a silent standoff. The words had been harsh, the tone condescending, yet Manny's calmness made the harshness stand out even more. It was a simple boarding situation, yet it was clear to everyone watching, respect was being withheld. And in that quiet first-class cabin, the tiny cracks of arrogance and prejudice began to show. The passengers felt it, the attendants felt it, and Manny, as always, remained perfectly aware. This was no ordinary confrontation. A storm was quietly brewing at 35,000 feet, and no one in that cabin would leave untouched by what was about to unfold. The plane hummed steadily as it climbed higher into the sky. The cabin lights reflected softly off polished trays and seatback screens, giving the first-class section a serene, almost luxurious glow. For most passengers, this was a routine flight, coffee in hand, newspapers rustling, business calls over headsets. But a subtle shift in energy began to ripple through the room, unnoticed by some, but immediately apparent to others. Manny Pacquiao walked down the aisle with the same calm confidence that had made him a global champion. There was no entourage, no security detail, no fanfare, just him. Polo shirt, dark jeans, simple sneakers, casual, approachable, yet exuding a quiet power that only a person who had conquered the world, both inside and outside the ring, could carry. The moment he approached the first-class section, the flight attendant's demeanor changed. Gone was the polite, professional greeting for passengers. In its place was a thinly veiled arrogance, a hint of condescension that immediately set Manny apart. One attendant, a tall woman with a tight bun and sharp eyes, took a small step forward, her arms crossed. Her voice carried more than protocol, it carried judgment. "Sir, this section is reserved," she said, with a crispness that seemed meant to intimidate. Manny paused, his expression serene, his gaze calm. He reached into his bag, pulled out his boarding pass, said evenly, voice measured, tone polite yet firm. The attendants exchanged subtle glances, whispers creeping into the air. He doesn't look like he belongs here, one said softly but deliberately, loud enough for a nearby passenger to hear. The words hung in the air like a sudden chill. Passengers shifted, sensing the tension, but unsure why. Some turned their heads, curious. Others instinctively reached for their phones. The subtle arrogance of the attendants clashed violently with Manny's composed presence. The young man across the aisle, sensing something unusual, leaned over and whispered to his neighbor, "Isn't that?" But he didn't finish. Everyone was watching now, even if they didn't know exactly what was happening. The silent clash of ego and calm presence was electrifying. Manny's eyes scanned the cabin, noting every reaction. There was no anger in his gaze, no hint of frustration, just quiet awareness. He noticed the slight hesitation of a female attendant trying to hand him a menu, the stiff posture of a male attendant pretending to adjust the cabin remained tense, the quiet hum of the engines almost drowned out by the invisible storm brewing among the flight attendants. Manny Pacquiao sat calmly, flipping through a magazine, his demeanor unchanged, his aura radiating quiet authority. But around him, the air had thickened with unspoken judgment. Each subtle movement of the flight attendants conveyed a simmering mix of doubt, suspicion, and condescension. One attendant, a younger woman with sharp features and a tightly pulled bun, leaned slightly forward. Her voice, though lowered, cut sharply across the aisle. "Are you sure this is a first-class passenger?" Another attendant, taller, arms crossed, smirked quietly. "He doesn't look important. Ordinary. Why is he even here?" Passengers shifted uncomfortably. Phones were subtly raised, cameras pointed discreetly, whispers spreading like wildfire. The tension had moved beyond a simple seating dispute. It had become a clash of ego versus dignity, of prejudice versus calm authority. Manny did not look up immediately. He remained quiet, serene, flipping through the magazine as though he hadn't heard a word. Yet every word, every gesture was being noted, catalogued in his mind with the precision of a champion studying an opponent. He knew exactly what was happening. They were trying to intimidate him, assert dominance, test him. And as always, he would respond not with anger, but with control. A passenger in the row ahead whispered to his neighbor, "Do they even know who he is? Look at how they're talking to him." The whispers grew. Passengers began to exchange glances. Some realized they were witnessing something unusual. A man being judged unfairly, not for his ticket or conduct, but for his appearance. Others, still unaware of Manny's identity, felt the injustice in the air. It was palpable, almost physical, the way arrogance and entitlement collided with calm, unshakable presence. The tall attendant stepped closer, lowering her voice but sharpening her tone. "Sir, we can't allow you to sit here. You'll need to move to economy." Manny finally looked up, eyes calm, voice even. "I am booked for this seat. I am happy to show you my boarding pass again." The words were simple, polite, but carried a weight far heavier than any raised voice. The cabin felt it. The power of quiet dignity was now on full display, and the arrogance of the attendants was beginning to crack under the pressure. One of the younger passengers, emboldened, whispered to the person beside him, "Isn't that Manny Pacquiao?" The revelation rippled through the cabin. Eyes widened. Some attendants stiffened, their glares faltering. Their whispers, meant to intimidate, had been drowned out by the collective realization that they had misjudged a man of immense reputation and accomplishment. Yet, they did not apologize. Ego still clung stubbornly to their shoulders. One attendant, clearly flustered, muttered, "It's just a coincidence. He looks normal. Ordinary. Anyone could." Manny, closing his magazine, finally raised his gaze to meet theirs. Not in anger, not in threat, but in calm scrutiny. His eyes were steady, unyielding. "You judged me before knowing me," he said quietly, but with a weight that filled the cabin. "And that tells me everything about your character." The cabin went utterly silent. Passengers leaned forward, some in awe, others in disbelief. Even those who hadn't recognized him now felt the authority in his presence. The subtle arrogance of the attendants, intended to dominate, had crumbled under the quiet power of respect and self-assurance. A senior flight attendant whispered to her colleague, almost too softly to hear, We treated him like a stranger." "Yes," came the barely audible reply, "and he's someone important, isn't he?" The tension was at its peak. Manny did not move, did not raise his voice. His calmness magnified their mistakes. Their ego, which had driven them to speak harshly, now made them appear small, insecure, almost foolish in the eyes of the passengers. Passengers began exchanging quiet comments. Some reached for phones to capture the moment, not for scandal, but to witness the unfolding human drama. The juxtaposition was striking. A man of quiet authority, facing prejudice and arrogance, yet holding his ground with dignity. Minutes passed. The attendants' harsh tones had disappeared, replaced by hesitant glances and whispered apologies they were too proud to voice aloud. The cabin was charged with a new energy, recognition, shame, and the dawning understanding that respect is not commanded by position or uniform. It is earned through fairness, humility, and decency. And through it all, Manny Pacquiao remained calm, silent, observant. His presence had shifted the entire cabin. The judgment, the arrogance, and the harsh words had exposed the weakness of those who believed power could be wielded through condescension. For every passenger, every witness in that cabin, one lesson was clear. Arrogance and prejudice may speak loudly, but quiet dignity and respect speak even louder. The cabin had grown quiet, too quiet. Even the hum of the engines seemed subdued, as though the plane itself was holding its breath. Every passenger was now acutely aware of the tension that had been building for minutes. It was no longer a simple dispute over seats. This was a collision of arrogance and calm authority, of prejudice versus respect. And at the center of it all, Manny Pacquiao remained seated, serene, a silent force that drew every eye. Whispers began to ripple through the first-class section. Passengers who had been quietly observing now leaned forward, murmuring to one another. Some recognized him immediately, some didn't, yet the aura of quiet command was undeniable. An elderly woman, her fingers clutching a small leather purse, whispered to the man beside her, "Do you see that? He hasn't said much, yet everyone is uneasy. Why is that?" Her companion nodded slowly. "It's his presence. There's something about him. Calm, but commanding. You can feel it in the room." Meanwhile, the flight attendants fidgeted. Their prior confidence, their assumption that they could intimidate a passenger into moving, had evaporated. Every glance Manny gave seemed to quietly expose their insecurity. One attendant looked down at her clipboard, tapping her pen nervously as if pretending to be busy could shield her from embarrassment. Another tried to straighten a seatbelt, but her hands trembled slightly. Manny's calmness contrasted sharply with their growing unease. He had not raised his voice. He had not argued. Yet his composed presence was more powerful than any words they could have spoken. Passengers noticed this immediately. Some discreetly raised their phones, not to mock or provoke, but to capture a rare moment of dignity confronting injustice. A young man in the middle row whispered to his neighbor, voice barely audible, "Isn't that Manny Pacquiao, the boxing champion?" The revelation spread through the cabin like wildfire. Heads turned, eyes widened. Some passengers gasped softly, others smothered small smiles of disbelief. Recognition transformed the tension into shock. The attendants froze mid-step, their condescending energy faltering. Suddenly, they were no longer in control. Their harsh treatment, intended to assert dominance, now exposed their misjudgment in full view of every passenger. One attendant whispered, almost inaudibly, to another, He's Manny Pacquiao?" "Yes," came the hesitant reply, voice shaking. "The champion, he's famous?" The cabin had shifted. What had been a routine flight now felt like a stage, with Manny at its center. Every subtle glance, every whispered comment among the crew was amplified by the realization of their mistake. The once harsh, confident attitudes of the attendants now appeared small, insecure, almost foolish. Passengers exchanged quiet murmurs, nodding to one another, the collective understanding settling in. They had witnessed an act of arrogance, and it had been met with calm dignity. Some smiled, some shook their heads in disbelief, others simply sat in awe. The power dynamics had inverted without a single raised voice. An elderly clerk-turned-passenger muttered to her neighbor, "It's amazing. He hasn't done anything, and yet the entire cabin feels different. The energy? It's changed." Even the attendants, now aware of the eyes upon them, seemed to shrink. Their initial arrogance, intended to intimidate, had only highlighted their prejudice. Each gesture of rudeness was now magnified, and the passengers saw it all. Judgment had been loud, but calm authority had spoken louder. Manny did not move. He did not intervene. His silence was purposeful, controlled, and it radiated strength. The cabin now felt smaller, more intimate, as if the air itself recognized the quiet tension. Whispers continued among passengers, cameras discreetly recording, hearts racing with the drama of what was unfolding. For several minutes, this quiet standoff persisted. The flight attendants' attempts to maintain composure faltered under the weight of recognition and shame. Their harsh tones had disappeared, replaced by uneasy glances and whispered doubts. And through it all, Manny Pacquiao remained calm, silent, observant. His presence alone had shifted the cabin's energy. Arrogance and prejudice had been exposed. The passengers understood what the attendants had not. Respect is not demanded, it is earned, and it cannot be faked. In that moment, the flight had transformed. From an ordinary, mundane journey, it had become a subtle but powerful lesson in human decency. Every person in that cabin, passenger or crew, was now a witness to the quiet, unshakable authority of dignity in the face of unfairness. Minutes later, as whispers continued and phones were lowered, the stage was set for the inevitable confrontation that would follow, the moment when recognition would meet accountability. The cabin was heavy with silence. Passengers still whispered among themselves, glancing at each other and then back at Manny Pacquiao, trying to process what was happening. The flight attendants, once confident and sharp, now fidgeted under the weight of the passengers' stares. Their earlier arrogance had vanished like mist under the morning sun. Every movement seemed hesitant, every glance sheepish. The subtle shift in power was now undeniable. Suddenly, the intercom crackled, breaking the tension slightly. "Attention, first-class cabin, Mr. Manny Pacquiao. We apologize for the delay in assisting you," said a voice that was calm, professional, and full of respect. It was the senior flight supervisor, walking briskly down the aisle. The attendants froze mid-step, their mouths opening slightly, then closing again. Eyes wide, they exchanged glances that screamed disbelief. Passengers leaned forward, sensing that the moment of revelation had arrived. The supervisor approached Manny with a small bow of her head, her tone sincere. "Sir, please accept our apologies for the earlier confusion. It won't happen again. You are welcome to your seat, and we are here to serve you." The cabin's atmosphere shifted instantly. A collective exhale of relief and astonishment swept through the passengers. Even those who hadn't recognized Manny's face yet felt the tension dissolve. Whispers grew louder, some voices trembling with awe. One passenger, barely able to contain his excitement, muttered to his neighbor, "That's him? Manny Pacquiao?" The realization spread like wildfire. The flight attendants' faces drained of color. They had judged him based on appearances, on casual clothing, and a quiet demeanor. And now they faced the truth. He was the world-renowned champion, the man they had just spoken to harshly. Manny, still calm and composed, looked at the attendants. His gaze was steady, piercing, but not angry. He spoke softly, but his words carried a weight that filled the cabin. "You judged me before knowing me," he said, "and that tells me everything about your understanding of respect and leadership." The cabin fell utterly silent again. Passengers leaned forward, some nodding in agreement, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The young man who had whispered earlier now looked directly at the attendants, incredulous. "Did they really treat him like a stranger?" he whispered. The attendants fumbled for words. One of them finally stammered, We didn't know." Manny nodded slightly, as if acknowledging their words without needing confrontation. His calm, unshakable presence had already conveyed the message. Arrogance and prejudice have consequences. Respect, once withheld, must now be earned. Passengers began murmuring, some discreetly recording, others whispering their opinions. Have you ever witnessed someone being judged unfairly? Comment. Respect. If you believe everyone deserves dignity, or no, if you think prejudice should always be called out. The senior supervisor now turned to the attendants, her tone firm but measured. Apologize to him immediately. This is standard protocol. Mistreatment of any passenger is unacceptable, regardless of assumptions or appearance. The attendants, visibly shaken, approached Manny with hesitant bows, muttering apologies that barely reached his ears. He simply nodded, accepting them with quiet dignity, no anger, no resentment. Passengers were now openly whispering, some with smiles of admiration, others shaking their heads in disbelief at how quickly arrogance had been exposed. A mother whispered to her child, "See? Respect isn't about how someone looks. It's about who they are." Even the crew's body language told a story of realization. Their initial condescension had been loud, visible, and proud. Now they were subdued, humbled, and painfully aware of their error. Manny leaned back slightly, a subtle smile crossing his face. He had not needed to raise his voice or demand compliance. His calm confidence had done all the work. Passengers who had never witnessed a confrontation of this kind were in awe. They understood the lesson without needing it to be spoken. Judgments made on appearances are shallow, fragile, and often wrong. Respect is quiet but undeniable. It cannot be forced. What would you have done if you were on this flight? If you defend respect, or observe if you'd watch quietly like Manny? The cabin's energy had completely shifted. What had begun as tension, arrogance, and subtle hostility was now transformed into a palpable atmosphere of respect, acknowledgement, and subtle admiration. Every passenger had witnessed a simple but profound truth. Power doesn't scream. It commands quietly, firmly, and with dignity. Manny Pacquiao remained seated, composed, watching the crew regain their professionalism. The silent lesson had delivered. Judgment had been exposed. Respect had been earned, not through confrontation, but through presence, calm, and unwavering dignity. The cabin's tension had dissipated, replaced by a quiet, reflective calm. Passengers leaned back in their seats, some still exchanging glances, silently absorbing what had just transpired. The harsh words, the dismissive attitudes, the subtle arrogance of the flight attendants. It had all been laid bare, and the truth was undeniable. Manny Pacquiao, seated with perfect composure, had quietly commanded the room without raising his voice, without issuing threats, and without forcing compliance. His presence alone had delivered the lesson. Respect cannot be demanded. It must be recognized and reciprocated. The senior flight supervisor now stood firmly near Manny's row. Her expression was composed, professional, but underneath it lay an unmistakable acknowledgement of the attendants' prior errors. She addressed them calmly but firmly. This behavior is unacceptable. Every passenger deserves respect and fair treatment. Apologize immediately to Mr. Pacquiao. The attendants, previously sharp and confident, now appeared small and uncertain. Their harsh demeanor had been stripped away by the realization of their misjudgment. One by one, they approached Manny, heads bowed slightly, voices low, muttering apologies that were awkward but sincere. I'm sorry, sir. That was not professional. We didn't know. We misjudged you. Manny nodded once, a subtle acknowledgement. His calmness conveyed understanding, not anger. He accepted the apologies without rebuke, demonstrating that true power does not humiliate or belittle. It simply asserts itself with dignity. Passengers watched the exchange in quiet awe. Some had recognized Manny earlier. Others had realized just moments ago who he was. But regardless of fame or recognition, the lesson resonated equally for all. Arrogance and prejudice always leave their mark, but composure and respect leave a far stronger impression. The cabin began to breathe again. Conversations resumed, soft and subdued, as the earlier tension slowly gave way to normalcy. Yet, the atmosphere was permanently altered, not with anger, but with awareness. Everyone on board had witnessed a moment of justice delivered silently, effectively, and completely. Manny adjusted his seat slightly, leaning back comfortably. His aura of calm confidence was unmistakable. Every movement, every subtle gesture conveyed authority without aggression. The flight attendants now moved with a newfound respect, attending to passengers with professionalism, aware that their prior conduct had been flawed and that their actions would now be measured carefully. A young passenger, still in disbelief, whispered to her neighbor, "Did you see that? He didn't yell, he didn't get angry, and yet the whole cabin changed." Her neighbor nodded slowly. "Yes, that's what real dignity looks like." Even the attendants, now fully professional and attentive, had absorbed the lesson. Their initial arrogance had been loud and visible. Now their humility was equally clear. They understood that respect is not about asserting authority through condescension or harshness, but through fairness, empathy, and recognition of every individual's inherent dignity. The senior supervisor returned to her duties, but her presence remained a subtle reminder that professionalism is non-negotiable. The flight continued, but the earlier incident had left a lasting impression. Passengers whispered quietly among themselves, not about gossip or scandal, but about the clarity of character and the power of calm authority displayed in the first-class cabin. Manny remained seated, serene, almost meditative. There was no fanfare, no exaggerated gestures, no need for recognition. His quiet presence had done more than any words could have done. He had restored balance, held everyone accountable in the most subtle and effective manner, and reaffirmed that respect is earned, not assumed. By the time the flight reached cruising altitude, the cabin was transformed. The previous tension was replaced by a sense of awareness and reflection. Passengers continued to glance toward Manny, not in adulation, but with a quiet appreciation for the lesson they had witnessed. The flight attendants, now fully attentive, moved with professionalism and courtesy, their earlier mistake corrected not through punishment, but through the undeniable presence of integrity. The remainder of the flight proceeded smoothly. No further issues arose, and the atmosphere was now calm, respectful, and focused. Manny Pacquiao had once again demonstrated that true power lies not in force, intimidation, or harsh words, but in quiet confidence, composure, and unwavering dignity. As passengers settled in for the long journey ahead, one truth lingered: arrogance and prejudice are temporary, but calm authority, respect, and dignity endure. Manny had not only reclaimed his space, but had silently taught everyone on board an unforgettable lesson in human decency, humility, and the quiet strength that comes from knowing one's worth. As the plane leveled off, the hum of the engines filled the cabin, steady and rhythmic, like the heartbeat of the journey itself. Passengers settled back into their seats, but the earlier tension had left an indelible mark. What had started as a simple flight, an ordinary routine for most, had transformed into a living lesson in respect, dignity, and the power of calm authority. Every person on board, from the first-class travelers to the flight attendants, carried the subtle, unspoken understanding that they had witnessed something rare and extraordinary. Manny Pacquiao remained seated, composed and serene, exuding an aura that needed no amplification. His calm demeanor had done what words could not. It had revealed the consequences of judgment based on appearances, the fragility of arrogance, and the strength of dignity. He had never raised his voice, never demanded acknowledgement, yet the cabin had shifted entirely because of him. He had shown that respect is not a reward. It is a responsibility, one that is earned through humility, fairness, and recognition of another human being's inherent value. The flight attendants, now moving with measured professionalism, understood the weight of their earlier actions. Their condescension had been loud, visible, and striking in its arrogance. Now, in contrast, their humility was equally visible. Every gesture of service, every polite exchange with passengers, carried with it the silent acknowledgement that respect is not optional. It is the foundation of human interaction. Passengers whispered to one another, sharing observations, their voices low, but filled with awe. One young woman sitting by the window murmured, "It wasn't just what he said, It was how he made everyone feel, calm yet commanding. Her companion nodded, eyes wide. Exactly. Respect isn't loud, it's quiet, but you feel it. You know it when it's there. Even those who had never followed Manny's career closely felt the impact of the moment. It wasn't about fame or achievements. It was about character, about standing firm with dignity, even when judged unfairly, about allowing calm, unwavering integrity to speak louder than anger or authority ever could. Manny leaned back slightly in his seat, adjusting his polo shirt casually, yet every subtle movement radiated confidence and composure. No triumph had to be declared, no words had to be shouted. The lesson was already complete. It was a lesson for the attendants, a lesson for the passengers, and even a lesson for anyone who would hear the story later. Power and respect are inseparable when wielded wisely. In quiet moments, as passengers reflected, the true moral became evident. Arrogance, prejudice, and harsh judgment may seem powerful, but they are fleeting. They create tension, discomfort, and embarrassment. Dignity, humility, and calm authority, on the other hand, command attention, earn respect, and leave a lasting impression. True strength is subtle. True authority is measured. True respect is unconditional, extending to every individual, regardless of appearance, status, or background. The flight continued smoothly, the previous friction replaced by a pervasive sense of reflection. Conversations were gentler, smiles more genuine, and the cabin exuded a newfound respect for human decency. Even the quietest passengers seemed to sit straighter, more aware of the unseen currents of judgment and integrity that had just passed through the aisle. Manny Pacquiao's actions, simple, composed, and powerful, had demonstrated a universal truth. Judging someone by their appearance, their clothes, or their demeanor is not strength. It is insecurity in disguise. Respect is not demanded through loudness, threats, or harsh words. It is earned through fairness, observation, and acknowledgement of another human being's intrinsic worth. As the plane hummed steadily at cruising altitude, one thought lingered in the minds of all who had witnessed the episode. Respect transcends fame, money, and position. It is universal, it is non-negotiable, and it begins with seeing another person as they are, not as you assume them to be. Type respect. If you believe everyone deserves dignity, and tell us where you're watching from, your voice matters. The story of the flight would remain with every passenger, not as gossip, not as a tale of celebrity, but as a profound lesson in human character. Manny had transformed a moment of prejudice into a living example of integrity, teaching that calm, dignified authority always triumphs over arrogance, and that respect is a reflection of the strength within ourselves. In the end, the first-class cabin was no longer just a section of a plane. It had become a stage where the quiet power of humility, the unwavering force of dignity, and the lasting weight of respect had been fully displayed. And as Manny Pacquiao looked out the window, serene and composed, the passengers understood that they had all witnessed something far greater than a flight. They had witnessed a lesson in humanity itself.